Hello! Perhaps you are wondering why I'm starting here with the picture of a scooter. Well, let me explain. This is the high school I attended back then. And when we started high school, we were really looking forward to finally become 16. Because with 16, back then, we have been allowed to drive a tiny motorcycle. We are only allowed to drive a car with 18 here in Europe, but with 16 we are allowed to drive a tiny motorcycle. And when it comes to this, there are two huge options. One option is to go with a more traditional moped, and another option is to go with a scooter. And for some reason, the moped people have not been best friends with the scooter people. We were discussing really hard about what is better, a moped or a scooter. And when looking back to this, somehow this discussion was ridiculous. Because at the end of the day, there is not a thing like the best option. Everything comes with advantages and with disadvantages, and you need to evaluate in the context of your current situation. Well, honestly, the biggest advantage of having a motorcycle or a scooter was to belong to this or to that group, to belong to the moped group or to belong to the scooter group. But in general, I would say this is always the case when we are talking about doing a decision. It's always about consequences in your very situation. And this really reminds me to software architecture and especially to micro-frontend architectures. Because micro-frontends have been heavily discussed in the last month, and they come with a lot of consequences. Not all of them are great. There are a huge of disadvantages when it comes to micro-frontends. Well, if you are wondering what micro-frontends are about, basically they are about not writing a huge application. Instead of this, you write several tiny, less complex applications you need to integrate into each other. And this is what this talk is about. In this talk, I will show you why some of my customers decided for micro-frontend architectures. This is also where I will point out some of the disadvantages, some of the consequences. And then I want to show you how to implement a micro-frontend architecture with Angular. Of course, there are several options. I will focus on a very modern option, which is called module federation. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I am Manfred. I am a trainer and consultant for Angular. I'm focusing on Angular for enterprise scale applications. I'm quite connected to the Angular community and I live in Austria. Besides this, I do a lot of stuff in Germany and sometimes I'm working together with people in other countries. Okay, let's get started with the first topic I have prepared for you. It's about the why. Why have my customers used micro-frontend architectures in the past? Well, to answer this question, I gave them some questionnaires and they filled it out, and here is the conclusion of it. One of my customers is Daedalus Healthcare. Formerly, they have been known as Agfa Healthcare. They sit here in Europe and they are implementing a huge hospital information system. Well, honestly, I know Agfa since I'm a little boy because they have produced those audio cassettes. And they really had a lot of audio cassettes from the Agfa band. But nowadays, this division is implementing a healthcare solution, a hospital information system. And you can imagine if you implement a huge product or even a product suite for a hospital, you have a lot of business domains. Business domains for that you need several teams where each team is specialized in at least one of those domains. That's why they decided for micro-frontends. Each team is producing code for one of those specialist domains and then everything is integrated into a bigger application. And that means all those teams can work somehow in isolation. They can work in an autarkic way without the need to wait for other teams before they can deploy, for instance. This brings back a lot of agility. Another customer I sent out my questionnaire to is DATEV. DATEV is also an European company. As you see here, they are quite huge and they are specialized into software for lawyers and for accountants. And one of their biggest products is their payroll accountant solution. For their payroll accounting solution, they have about 80 people. And somehow you need to organize such a huge system. And that's why they decided for Micro-Frontends when they started with the new version of their product, the new version that is using Angular, of course. Another customer I've interviewed is a huge bank. I'm not allowed to tell the name or to show a screenshot, but what they are doing basically is they are currently re-implementing their e-banking system. And you know, for us customers, an e-banking system really looks cute. There is one dial that is telling me that I'm broke. There is another dial that is telling me that I won't get another credit. So it's really cute from our perspective. But from their perspective, it is a huge system. Each of those dials has some logic into it that comes from individual teams. Individual teams taking care of individual business domains. One team is specialized into account management, another team is specialized into loans, another team might be specialized into stocks. And somehow they need to bring together all the code from these teams in one tiny, cute frontend. That's why they are going with Micro-Frontends. By the way, they are using Micro-Frontends since quite a long time. They started using this architectural approach in times where there was not a term like Micro-Frontends. The term Micro-Frontends was only coined a bit later, but they started with it before it was a thing out of their business needs. How cool is that? Another huge bank is doing similar things for their customer relationship management system. Also here, the need to bring together several pieces of information from several domains about one customer. And last but not least, there is another customer of mine that is called Quality Bytes. They are located in Germany and they are a small business. They are also implementing an information system for hospitals, but they are only one agile team. They are about 10 people, give or take. And so we figured that splitting one application into several parts would be an overkill here. Because there is just one agile team, it would be an overkill if they needed to deal with several tiny Micro-Frontends. But what they are doing, and I think this is very clever, they are splitting their source code within a monorepo according to their business domains. And this makes sure that the software code of one business domain is not intermingled with the code of another business domain. For this they are using ng, by the way, ng monorepos. Well, I've asked them, why did you decide for Micro-Frontends? And nearly all of them told me, first and foremost, because we have a huge product or even a product suite, and we want to scale our teams. We want that one team can work in isolation on one business domain. The teams shall not block each other. They can work like an agile, very flexible team. And at the end of the day, this is all about teams and business domains, as you see here. Well, some of them also told me they want to be capable of switching out technologies if some technology becomes a legacy technology. And some other people told me they have a lot of changes regarding their requirements because of the law in the case of hospitals and payroll accounting, for instance. And so they need to have tiny flexible teams that can work in those changing requirements very quickly. But there are also some consequences. All of the teams I interviewed told me that the biggest consequence, the biggest negative consequence was the effort for building a meta framework. A meta framework is a tiny framework that is orchestrating all your micro-frontends in your browser window. For this, they needed to implement custom code, and somehow that was difficult for them. Also, they told me that sharing source code at runtime is quite difficult, but they need it because they want to decrease their overall bundle size. They do not want to load Angular 5 times just because they have 5 micro-frontends. They just want to load Angular once and only once, and this means they need to share the code of Angular at runtime, which was not easy until some months ago. Also, some companies told me that achieving a common look and feel was difficult. Well, while this common look and feel has to do with design systems, the former two options have to do with technical aspects. And for the rest of this presentation, I want to stick with those two technical aspects. Please keep those two things in mind. I will come back to them very shortly. Very shortly, because I only have 20 minutes in general. Okay, this was the first part. Now let's proceed with the second part. In this second part, I want to show you how to implement something like a micro-frontend architecture. And obviously, there are several options for this. Here, I want to show you the most modern option, which is Webpack 5 Module Federation. And as you will see, it really deals nicely with all those disadvantages we have discussed before. Basically, the idea of module federation is being capable of loading something from another domain. And perhaps you are saying now, well, that cannot be that difficult because we have dynamic imports. So why not use a dynamic import to load something from over there? Well, the thing is, in theory, this really works perfectly. In theory. In practice, this does not work at all because of how all the current bundling solutions work. Bundling solutions like Webpack, which is also used by the CLI. All those modern bundling solutions assume that all the source code is known at compile time. Even the lazy parts need to be known at compile time. Everything is compiled together, everything is optimized together. Think on tree shaking, for instance, and then everything is cut into chunks for lazy loading. But this is too late, because when it comes to micro-frontend, we want to load something at runtime that we didn't know back then at compile time. We want to implement the individual micro-frontends in isolation, we want to deploy them separately, and we just want to load the newest version or a configured version at runtime into our shell. And this is now solved by Webpack 5 Module Federation. For this, Module Federation introduces two roles. The first role is the host. In my case, it's the micro-frontend shell that loads all the micro-frontends, and the second role is the so-called remote, which is the micro-frontend in our case. You can configure both of them. For instance, you can say, well, this shell gets a URL that is called mfe1, and when we are importing something from this URL, we want to point over there to this micro-frontend, a separately compiled and deployed micro-frontend. And by the way, over there, it's also called mfe1. That means here you can define an alias, or as I did, a non-alias, if you want to put it that way. Over there in the micro-frontend, you can expose files. You can expose a file with an Ivy component or an Angular module or even a function. And now something beautiful happens. I guarantee you, you will love it. Now you can use just a dynamic import to point over there. That means from Angular's perspective, there is nothing special with this. From Angular's perspective, here we are just using lazy loading. Angular does not even know that Webpack underneath the covers is doing the heavy lifting. That Webpack is taking care of loading stuff from over there. That means we can use Angular as always, because Angular doesn't know about micro-frontends, and that means we don't need to go with a meter framework, which was one of the biggest disadvantages I have presented before. Building a meter framework for orchestrating your micro-frontends. No, forget it. With this solution, everything you need is lazy loading. Everything you need is not love, but a dynamic import. Also, module federation allows you to share libraries. You could say, well, I'm using Angular here, I'm using Angular there. Let's don't load it twice, just load it once and let's share it. This was the second disadvantage I have presented before. Sharing code was really difficult in the past. Nowadays it's as easy as configuring such an array. You can even configure when to share source code. You can say share it always or just share it if both of them are using the same major version. Or don't look at the major version at all, just go with the highest version, which might be an issue because with a new major version, you know, one can introduce breaking changes. But the thing is, when it comes to sharing code, module federation is very flexible. How can we use this together with Angular? Well, you need this tiny CLI plugin. You can ng edit. Then you need to adjust a generated configuration. That means you don't need to learn this configuration by heart. This plugin is generating it for you. You just need to fill in placeholders. And then you can ng-serve your solution and everything should be fine. Now let me show you a tiny demonstration for this. I'm always saying module federation is a bit like the 1980s. You need to experience them in order to know what they are about. So let's have a look at a tiny example here. In this example here, I have a shell. This is my micro-frontend shell. And as you see here, it runs on localhost 5000. And here I have my micro-frontend. You can see it by looking at the dashed lines. It has those red dashed lines around it, and it runs on localhost 3000. And no, using different ports, different origins is not a prerequisite here. But in this case, it is proving that I'm using separately compiled and deployed micro-frontends. And the best of this is when clicking here, the micro-frontend from over there, from the different origin, is directly loaded into my application. And if we look into the source code of this, we will see from Angular's perspective, this is really just like lazy loading. I have a lazy root here and I'm telling Angular to load something from that URL. And Angular does not know that this URL is mapped using the Webpack configuration, mapped to point over there to a child module of a separately compiled application. It's really as easy as that. At the end of the day, you have traditional Angular applications plus the Webpack configuration I've talked about before. Okay, let me come to a conclusion. So we have seen that micro-frontends are not a free lunch. They come with consequences and you really have to evaluate if the disadvantages are smaller than the advantages in your very situation. We have also seen that they are first and foremost for scaling teams. You want to scale your application across several teams that can work in isolation, that can work in an autarkic way, that can deploy separately. And we have seen that module federation is a nice new solution that is quite unobtrusive and that really solves the issues we've talked about in a very nice way. Issues like don't needing a meta framework, issues like sharing code at runtime to decrease the amount of bytes that go over the wire. And there is one last thing I want you to remember, namely, please remember the story with the scooters and the mopeds. Because this story tells you that there is not the best option in general. It tells you that you always need to evaluate in the context of your very situation. Please keep this in mind. This is what software architecture is about, and perhaps this is even what whole life is about. Okay, so thanks for having me. Here you find my contact data. Perhaps I have several blog articles about all this stuff, so if you want to go more into depth, please find all this material in my blog, and if you have any questions, reach out on Twitter. Thanks for having me and have a nice day.